Privacy becomes much easier to understand when you stop treating it as a separate moral topic and start treating it as a security risk topic with real operational consequences. Many brand new learners assume privacy is only about legal compliance or public relations, while security is about stopping hackers. But modern organizations cannot separate these cleanly because privacy decisions shape what data you collect, where you store it, who can access it, and what happens when something goes wrong. When privacy is ignored during risk decisions, the organization often ends up collecting too much, retaining it too long, and spreading it across systems in ways that are difficult to control. That creates more exposure, more obligations, and more damage when there is a leak or misuse, even if the original goal was convenience or business insight. Building privacy into risk decisions means you evaluate privacy harms alongside traditional security harms, and you design controls that reduce both. By the end of this manuscript, you should be able to connect sovereignty, biometrics, and data subject rights into a single practical framework for making better choices without drifting into vague statements or fear-based planning. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A privacy-aware risk decision starts with recognizing that privacy risk is not only the risk of a breach, but also the risk of inappropriate collection, inappropriate use, and inappropriate sharing. Confidentiality is about keeping data from unauthorized access, while privacy is about whether the organization had a legitimate reason to collect data, whether it is using the data in ways people expect, and whether people retain meaningful control over their information. For beginners, it helps to notice that privacy risk can exist even when security controls are strong, because a perfectly secured system can still be misused if the organization collects sensitive data unnecessarily or uses it beyond what was promised. This is why privacy shows up in SecurityX risk topics. Risk is not just threats and vulnerabilities. It is also impact, obligations, and trust. When an organization mishandles personal data, the costs can include legal penalties, forced operational changes, customer churn, and reputational harm that lasts longer than the technical incident. Treating privacy as part of risk decisions keeps the organization from solving one problem while quietly creating another. The next foundational move is understanding what counts as personal data and why it is so sensitive from a risk perspective. Personally identifiable information, PII, is a common category that includes information that can identify a person directly or indirectly, such as names, identifiers, contact information, and combinations of details that point to a specific individual. Beginners sometimes assume PII is only obvious items like a social security number, but many datasets become identifying when combined, like device identifiers plus location patterns plus account history. Privacy risk also includes special categories of data that can cause greater harm if misused, such as health data, financial data, or data about children, and those categories can trigger stricter obligations. Risk decisions become privacy-aware when you ask not only how do we protect this data, but also do we need this data at all? And if we do, can we reduce its sensitivity? Reducing sensitivity can mean collecting less, masking fields, using aggregated values, or designing processes that avoid storing personal details when they are not required. The fewer sensitive data points you hold, the smaller your target becomes. Sovereignty is the privacy topic that teaches you data is not just a technical object, but also a legal and political object, because data can be governed by where it is stored and where it is processed. Data sovereignty is the idea that data is subject to the laws and governance of the country or jurisdiction where it resides, and sometimes also where the data subject is located. Beginners often assume the internet is borderless, so data can live anywhere. But organizations quickly learn that regulators, contracts, and customers care deeply about where personal data is stored and who can access it. Sovereignty becomes a risk decision when you choose cloud regions, backup locations, and third-party providers, because those choices determine which legal regimes may apply and what government access requests could be possible. It also affects incident response, because notification timelines and reporting obligations can differ across jurisdictions. A privacy-aware organization evaluates sovereignty early because moving data later is expensive, and retrofitting compliance after deployment can create downtime, re-engineering, and business disruption. Thinking clearly about sovereignty also requires you to separate location from access, because data can be stored in one place and still be accessed from another place. A beginner might think storing data in a particular region solves the sovereignty issue, but if administrators in another country can access the systems, or if a service provider routes data through other regions for processing, the risk profile changes. This is why privacy-aware risk decisions often include controls around administrative access, encryption, and key management, because the ability to decrypt data can matter more than the ability to physically touch the storage. Sovereignty also intersects with vendor management, because vendors may use subprocessors and secondary services that change where data flows, and those flows can create unexpected jurisdictional exposure. For SecurityX scenarios, watch for clues like cross-border operations, global customers, or cloud services spanning regions, because those scenarios often require risk thinking that includes sovereignty constraints. The best decision is not always the most technically efficient, but the one that aligns data location, processing, access, and obligations in a way that reduces legal and operational surprises. Biometrics is the privacy topic that forces you to think about permanence and reversibility, because biometric traits are not like passwords that you can reset. Biometrics can include fingerprints, facial features, voice patterns, or other measurable characteristics used to verify identity, and they can make login experiences more convenient while also creating high-stakes privacy risk. Beginners sometimes assume biometrics are automatically safer because they feel personal and unique, but the risk is that biometric data, if compromised, can create lasting harm because you cannot simply issue a new fingerprint. Even when the system does not store a raw image, biometric templates and matching data can still be sensitive because they represent a durable identifier tied to a person. Biometrics also raise consent and purpose questions because collecting them is more intrusive than collecting a username, and people may feel coerced if biometrics are required without alternatives. From a risk decision perspective, biometrics require a higher bar. You must weigh convenience and security gains against privacy impact, legal obligations, and the consequences of compromise. A privacy-aware approach to biometrics starts by asking what problem biometrics are solving and whether there are less intrusive options that achieve similar outcomes. If the goal is strong authentication, multi-factor authentication, MFA, can sometimes provide robust security without requiring biometric collection, depending on the environment and threat model. When biometrics are used, risk decisions should emphasize minimizing what is stored, limiting retention, and controlling who can access biometric systems, because misuse risk can be as serious as breach risk. Another important decision is whether the biometric process happens locally on a device or centrally in an organization's systems, because centralized storage can create a bigger target. Beginners do not need to design architectures, but they should understand that centralization increases impact if something goes wrong. SecurityX questions may test this by asking what control reduces privacy risk when biometrics are deployed, and strong answers often involve limiting data exposure, using strict access control, and ensuring that biometric data is treated as highly sensitive with careful governance and monitoring. Data subject rights are the part of privacy that connects risk to individual control, because these rights define what individuals can ask an organization to do with their personal data. Rights commonly include the ability to access personal data, correct inaccurate data, delete data under certain conditions, and understand how data is used, depending on jurisdiction and policy. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, is often associated with these rights, but the deeper point is that privacy laws and expectations increasingly require organizations to design processes that can respond to individuals' requests. Beginners sometimes imagine rights as customer service tasks, but they are risk controls because failing to honor rights can lead to legal penalties and reputational harm. Rights also create technical and operational requirements, such as being able to find all instances of a person's data across systems, being able to correct or delete it without breaking records, and being able to prove that the request was handled properly. When you treat rights as part of risk decisions, you design data inventories, retention schedules, and access controls with these obligations in mind. The practical challenge with data subject rights is that you cannot fulfill them reliably if your data is scattered, duplicated, and poorly tracked. This is where privacy and security program discipline meet, because a program that does not know where data lives cannot protect it well and also cannot manage it well. Data inventories, classification, and ownership become essential because someone must be accountable for responding to requests and for ensuring the organization can locate relevant records. Beginners often think deletion is as simple as pressing a delete button, but many systems have backups, logs, caches, and analytics datasets that include copies, and those copies can complicate deletion obligations. A privacy-aware risk decision considers how data will be stored and replicated before the system is built, so rights can be honored without emergency re-engineering later. SecurityX scenarios may describe an organization unable to respond to deletion requests or access requests because data is in too many places, and the best answer often involves improving data governance and traceability rather than focusing only on perimeter defenses. Privacy is also tightly connected to risk decisions through the idea of proportionality, meaning you collect and use data in a way that is proportionate to the purpose and the risk. Beginners sometimes believe more data is always better because it enables analytics and personalization, but more data is also more liability. Every additional field you collect increases breach impact, increases the number of controls you must maintain, and increases the complexity of honoring data subject rights. Proportionality shows up in decisions about logging, monitoring, and telemetry as well, because security teams often want detailed logs for detection, but detailed logs can contain personal data and can become a privacy risk if retained too long or accessed broadly. A mature approach balances security visibility with privacy minimization, such as logging what you need for detection without capturing unnecessary personal details, and protecting logs as sensitive data stores. The exam may test this balance by presenting options that either ignore privacy entirely or cripple security monitoring, and the best choice is usually the one that preserves necessary security outcomes while minimizing privacy exposure. A key privacy risk decision tool is the Data Protection Impact Assessment, DPIA, which is a structured way to evaluate how a project might affect privacy and what mitigations are needed. You do not need to memorize a formal template to understand the logic, because the core questions are straightforward. What data is collected? Why is it collected? How is it processed? Who has access? What risks exist to individuals? And what controls reduce those risks? The important beginner insight is that privacy impact is not only about the organization's risk, but also about the individual's harm, such as identity theft, discrimination, loss of control, or unwanted surveillance. A DPIA helps ensure those harms are considered early, which prevents privacy from being tacked on after the system is already deployed. It also creates documentation that supports governance, because it records the reasoning behind decisions and the controls chosen. SecurityX may include scenario questions where a new technology, especially biometrics or large-scale data processing, is being introduced, and the right move often includes performing a structured privacy impact assessment before rollout. Privacy by design and privacy by default are two phrases that can sound like slogans, but they represent very practical choices that reduce risk over time. Privacy by design means you build systems with privacy controls from the start, such as minimizing collection, limiting access, and designing retention and deletion processes. Privacy by default means the system's default settings favor privacy, so users are not forced to opt out of exposure they never wanted. Beginners often assume privacy settings can be fixed later, but defaults matter because most people accept defaults, and because defaults shape how data accumulates over years. Defaults also matter in security because they influence access patterns, logging verbosity, and data sharing behaviors. When defaults are privacy-friendly, you reduce the chance that a rushed deployment creates a long-lived data exposure pattern. SecurityX questions may present scenarios where a system's default configuration exposed more personal data than intended, and the best answers often involve changing defaults, adding guardrails, and ensuring that privacy controls are not optional add-ons that teams can bypass under deadline pressure. Sovereignty, biometrics, and data subject rights also converge in vendor relationships because third parties often process personal data and sometimes provide biometric services or identity solutions. A privacy-aware risk decision includes evaluating whether a vendor uses subprocessors, where data is stored, how data is encrypted, and how rights requests will be handled when data is held by the vendor. Beginners sometimes assume rights requests are purely internal. But if a vendor holds personal data, your organization still needs a way to respond to individuals, which means the vendor must support retrieval, correction, deletion, and reporting within required timelines. Sovereignty concerns intensify here because vendors might store data in multiple regions or access it from global support teams, creating cross-border risk. Biometrics intensify the stakes because the data is more sensitive and the consequences of misuse are greater. SecurityX scenarios may describe a service provider handling customer information and ask what to do to reduce risk, and strong answers often involve contractual requirements, clear data processing rules, and ongoing monitoring rather than one-time vendor approval. When privacy becomes part of risk decisions, incident response and reporting also become more precise, because privacy incidents require you to think beyond technical containment. A breach involving personal data can trigger notification requirements and can require coordination among security, legal, privacy, and leadership teams. Beginners sometimes treat incident response as purely technical, but privacy-aware response includes assessing what personal data was involved, whether it was accessed, whether it was exposed across jurisdictions, and what individuals need to know to protect themselves. Sovereignty affects reporting because different jurisdictions can impose different timelines and content requirements for notification. Biometric exposure may require a more urgent response because of the permanence of identifiers and the high risk of misuse. Data subject rights can also appear during and after incidents, as individuals request information about what happened and what data was affected. SecurityX questions often reward answers that reflect disciplined coordination and evidence gathering so reporting is accurate, timely, and consistent with obligations, rather than answers that rush to communicate without understanding scope. Another area where privacy risk decisions become real is analytics and automation, because organizations increasingly use personal data for profiling, personalization, fraud detection, and operational decision-making. Beginners may assume analytics is harmless if it improves service, but privacy risk includes how inferences are made, how long data is retained, and whether individuals would expect those uses. When analytics uses biometrics or location data, the sensitivity increases and sovereignty constraints may apply more strongly. Privacy-aware risk decisions ask whether the outcome can be achieved with less data, whether aggregated data is sufficient, and whether access to analytics outputs should be restricted because those outputs can reveal personal patterns even without raw identifiers. This is also where interference and integrity concepts connect back, because manipulated data can lead to harmful decisions, and privacy harm can occur when individuals are misclassified or unfairly treated based on incorrect or biased data. While SecurityX does not require you to build analytics systems, it does expect you to recognize that privacy risk is amplified when data is used at scale and when decisions are automated, so stronger governance and careful limitation are needed. As we wrap up, building privacy into risk decisions means you treat privacy as a core part of security outcomes rather than an afterthought, because privacy choices shape exposure, obligations, and trust. Sovereignty teaches you that location and jurisdiction matter, and that cross-border storage and access decisions can create legal and operational risk that is hard to unwind later. Biometrics teaches you that some data is uniquely sensitive because it is durable and hard to replace, so the risk bar must be higher and controls must be tighter and more intentional. Data subject rights teach you that individuals have growing expectations and legal protections, which means your data governance must support retrieval, correction, deletion, and transparent handling. When you combine these with practical tools like DPIA, privacy by design, and privacy-friendly defaults, you create systems that collect less, expose less, and recover more cleanly when incidents occur. SecurityX rewards this integrated thinking because it demonstrates you can make decisions that reduce harm to individuals and risk to the organization at the same time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.